Hello, all you beautiful beings. I identify as queer. I'm not the only member of the LGBTQ+ community who does. My reasons for doing so are twofold. Firstly, I use it as a shorthand, and for talking about my own sexuality, romantic interest, and gender identity. I'm bisexual, but also polyamorous, panromantic, and a non-binary femme. It's taken me a while to feel comfortable exploring myself in this way. But wait, Phoenix, some of you might ask, isn't queer a slur? Why would you feel comfortable with that? Isn't it like calling yourself the N-word? Didn't a man baby recently use that term to insult a gay man? Aren't you fetishizing your oppression? Have a seat, folks. The word queer, meaning strange and peculiar, was, and sometimes still is, used as a pejorative term against people who aren't straight and/or cisgender. Basically, it was used to slander us and make us seem deviant, degenerate, and unnatural. The use of that term as a slur goes as far back as the 19th century. Its reclamation, however, well, that's a far more recent phenomenon. As I said in the first part of this series, the reclamation of queer goes back as far as the early 80s, when the AIDS crisis came to America. I, like probably a good chunk of my audience, am a bit too young to remember the depths of the pandemic, but that's what documentaries are for, right? Full disclosure, I'm well aware that HIV/AIDS is a global pandemic and there are many amazing activists all over the world fighting for those afflicted and vulnerable to it. For the purposes of this video, I'll mostly be focusing on activists in the United States.
All were angry and many were frightened, and they converged on City Hall demanding and pleading, and more than 200 were hauled off to the station house.
The first cases of AIDS in the United States were reported in 1981. By 1983, there were over 1,000 reported cases in the US, and by that point, already half had proven fatal. Unlike other high mortality rate viruses like Ebola, HIV tended not to be something one may eventually recover from once infected. Part of the slowed government response was because of the epidemic curve of the HIV virus. Unlike Ebola virus, it was gradual, with symptoms appearing in a matter of years instead of days. It's easier for epidemiologists to encourage behavior changes in a population for an in-your-face disease like smallpox or Ebola virus, but AIDS, despite its near 100% mortality rate, was so slow-moving that not only was mass behavior change difficult to encourage, most people who spread the virus did not themselves even know that they were infected. Drug use was a risk factor, unprotected sex was also a risk factor, but many risk factors were not in people's control. For instance, the 1980s was not a great time to be a hemophiliac. But another aspect was the factor that the epicenter of the outbreak was not in middle-class straight white families, but the gay community in urban centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City. Since all of the earliest cases were discovered in gay men, it was easy for lawmakers to moralize the outbreak, not just as a sexually transmitted disease, but also of moral degeneracy. Pat Buchanan, who was the leader of White House communications at the time, wrote about AIDS, the poor homosexuals. They have declared war on nature, and now nature is exacting an awful retribution. Reagan didn't seem to understand the seriousness of the epidemic until his friend Rock Hudson announced that he was HIV positive 4 years into the epidemic, but even then it wasn't enough to get the administration to act on it. Dr. Donald P. Francis, an epidemiologist within the CDC assigned to the AIDS outbreak, later wrote, "Doctors confronting a new epidemic caused by a highly fatal infectious agent are much like firefighters confronting a fire. Early aggressive action pays off, whereas slow passive action leads to massive destruction." The CDC, with the help of Francis, developed a comprehensive plan in 1985 to help stop the spread of HIV, which had by now infected thousands, but the Reagan administration rejected it outright. The administration told epidemiologists within the CDC to look pretty and do as little as possible. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop was explicitly banned by the Reagan administration from addressing the AIDS crisis. When in 1986 he broke with orders and did address what was by now a pandemic, he was attacked from within all areas of the administration. The powers that be within the CDC refused to stand up to their bosses higher up in the Reagan administration. Director of the CDC, James Mason, regarding the CDC's failure to act, later said, "There are certain areas which, when the goals of science collide with moral and ethical judgment, Science has to take a time out. By the late 1980s, with now hundreds of thousands of new cases of HIV, it wasn't an issue of passivity, but of active obstruction. An increasingly popular narrative surrounding the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s was that there was nothing to be done to stop it, that the onus was solely on the infected, and there was nothing but their own behavior to blame. But the spread of HIV/AIDS in the United States was not inevitable, and had the powers that be acted sooner, millions of lives could have been saved. This is what happens when governments fail the people they are sworn to protect.
Plague! We are in the middle of a plague, and you behave like this. Plague! 40 million infected people is a plague. We are in the worst shape we have ever been in. All those pills we're shoveling down our throats, forget it.
San Francisco's Castro district has become a little more heterosexual, a slightly upscale shopping street, since the days in the 80s and 90s when AIDS was devastating the gay male population that gathered here. But in America today, when the disease is mostly controlled through drugs, the Castro remains a focal point of gay life, still the place gay youngsters come to find the freedom and acceptance that is sometimes hard to find at home.
I think the Castro is really still probably the gayest neighborhood in the world.
It's where David Weissman produced and directed his film We Were Here, that recounts personal stories of the AIDS epidemic.
It became clear to me that the people who had lived through the epidemic in those years had stopped talking about it, and the people who didn't live through that time really knew very little about the origins of the AIDS epidemic and what our community went through in the early years. So it seemed like with the passage of time since the medications started working and the death rates started to go down, it was a good time to look back at that era and try to make sense of what actually happened, what we actually went through as a community.
Within a 15-year period, nearly 20,000 people died in this city alone after AIDS swept through the gay community starting in the early 1980s.
Even in the middle of the epidemic, I came back to San Francisco after living in Europe for a year, and I expected Castro Street to have tumbleweeds blowing down it and to be a ghost town. But one of the things that's most amazing in looking back at this is that even in the midst of terrible horror and terrible trauma, life has to go on. You don't really have a choice.
Of Star Pharmacy, and there were these little Polaroid photographs that this young man had made of himself. There were at least 3, maybe 4 of them. The first one was like this, and inside these big purple splotches.
I've been around for the entire epidemic. The only thing I can liken it to is a war zone, but most of us have never lived in a war zone, but it's you never knew where the bomb was going to drop.
We're forced to deal with this unbelievable circumstance of a community that, in addition to being hated and under attack, is now forced alone to try to figure out how to deal with this extraordinary medical disaster. We are now.
Needless to say, LGBT folks were drop-kicked under the bus, then repeatedly backed over by it. Despite what a certain abrasive trans woman might tell you, slurs are not the reason for this. The truth of the matter is, well, a negative stigma exists that paints people who are victims as good or bad depending on the circumstances. People afflicted with HIV/AIDS because of rape, tainted blood transfusions, or being born to one or more people carrying the virus are considered more innocent than people who contracted it through heroin use, sex work, and yes, gay sex. And this, like all stigmas, is undeserved. AIDS is a horrible disease that no one deserves, especially not over having a mental illness, such as a drug addiction, working to make a living, by selling a service, or just being who you are, as in being gay or trans. In reality, being LGBT is still not considered normal. Hell, that's why the label queer is used as a slur. But its reclamation with the statement, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," is a declaration of, yes, I'm gay, I'm still a human, I'm sick and need treatment for this disease ravaging my body. You, in Congress, you at the FDA, you in the voting booth, get off your butts and help me. Why queer? Well, yes, gay is great. It has its place. But when a lot of lesbians and gay men wake up in the morning, we feel angry and disgusted, not gay. So we've chosen to call ourselves queer. Using queer is a way of reminding us how we are perceived by the rest of the world. It's a way of telling ourselves we don't have to be witty and charming people who keep our lives discreet and marginalized in the straight world. We use queer as gay men loving lesbians and lesbians loving being queer. Queer, unlike gay, doesn't mean male. And when spoken to other gays and lesbians, it's a way of suggesting we close ranks and forget, temporarily, our individual differences because we face a far more insidious common enemy. Yeah, queer can be a rough word, but it's also a sly and ironic weapon we can steal from the homophobe's hands and use against him.
All our best names like Bruce and Lance and Julian, those were the toughest names we had. Now they're just,
Queer?
Yeah, and that's another thing. I resent you people using that word. That's our word for making fun of you. We need...
In closing, I just want to say that if you personally are averse to using the word queer to define yourself, that's fine and I won't say a boo to you. However, if you want to say that my using it, despite its political history and power, makes me self-hating, that is the second when you are free to kiss my ass. Thank you very much, and as always, peace, love, and stay hydrated.